Welcome to the latest episode of the IEA School of Thought series with me, Syed Kamall. I'm the Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. Now, this series is based on the IEA book, School of Thought, 101 Great Liberal Thinkers by Dr Eamonn Butler, which, as the title suggests, summarises the thoughts of leading classical liberal thinkers on a range of issues, and then we discuss them within a modern context. All the episodes in this series and all our other online content can be found on our IEA YouTube channel, IEA London, on Podbean, and also on our website, iea.org.uk. Today's featured thinker is American philosopher Robert Nozick, best known for his book Anarchy, State and Utopia, which, as Eamonn Butler writes, was a counterblast to John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. To discuss Robert Nozick, and indeed John Rawls, I'm joined by the Director General of the IEA, Mark Littlewood. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Syed.
Great. Can I start off by asking, why did you pick Robert Nozick? What was it about him? Did he inspire you personally? Was it something, did you read Anarchy, State and Utopia and there was a sort of eureka moment? What was it?
Yeah, pretty much it's that really. It was my Road to Damascus book that made me into a libertarian. The different interpretations of liberalism by John Rawls and Robert Nozick were the fundamental building blocks of the political theory course back when I was at university in the 90s. I don't know if they still are now, I hope they are. And reading Anarchy, State and Utopia, which I think is a brilliantly written book, but pretty much overnight, I'm exaggerating only a little for effect, converted me from a rather sort of soggy, middle-of-the-road social democrat into a libertarian. I wasn't prejudiced in favour of Nozick's argument. In fact, I began by being hostile to him. I wanted to find arguments that endorsed my prejudice about redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor. But I found Nozick's book so completely compelling that it changed my own personal political ideology. So that makes it all sound a bit about me, but I think it is an important book in its own right. I think it would be considered one of the modern libertarian classics. I think it's compelling. I'm not sure that Nozick gets everything bang on right, but I think he does provide an extremely good riposte to John Rawls, who is more of a social liberal, especially when it comes to redistribution of wealth. And I think he provides a fascinating framework through which people of a classical liberal mindset can see, understand, and justify their philosophical approach to the world.
Now, as Eamonn Butler writes, the Anarchy, State and Utopia was intended as a counterblast to Rawls' theory of justice. Now, some people, including yourself, I understand, feel that Rawls has been sort of interpreted or misinterpreted or treated harshly by history, rather than the way that people look at Keynes and say Keynes wouldn't have agreed with modern Keynesians. Do you want to explain that a bit?
Yeah, I don't know whether Rawls is treated harshly by history. I think he's been quite well treated by history in the same way as Keynes. But I think that John Rawls is seen as an intellectual enemy of classical liberalism. And I'm not so sure that's true. That there's a key point of difference, the major key point of difference really in practical terms between John Rawls and Robert Nozick is about whether there's a justification to redistribute wealth or resources to assist the poorest. And because that's really the fulcrum of the debate between them, I think rather too much emphasis is placed on John Rawls' support for redistribution and insufficient emphasis on his very, very liberal approach to the world. If you like, because Nozick and Rawls don't really disagree on freedom of speech, you don't really hear much about Rawls' approach to freedom of speech. The point of difference really between them comes down. It's not exclusively only about redistribution of wealth, but it fundamentally is about that. So to that extent, I think Rawls is oversimplified and characterized as a kind of liberal on the left, and Nozick as a liberal on the right, but they're both liberals in my view. So perhaps I should start by saying something about John Rawls and what he actually came up with. So Rawls, in his book, A Theory of Justice, to which Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia was a reply or a riposte, set himself really the task, I don't think he describes it in quite this way, but sets himself the task of trying to explain what it is that we find uncomfortable, possibly even morally repugnant about utilitarianism. The idea that all that matters in the world is maximizing the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And Rawls suggests that actually we have rather more liberal and individualistic feelings than that. We shouldn't sacrifice the happiness of a small number of people on the altar of making a wide number of people a bit happier. Humans can't be treated as equations. So what Rawls does is to posit really a new idea of the social contract. What is it that we have or would agree to be, and by what process could we agree, even if you like retrospectively, the founding principles and rules that govern our society. And he suggests, and it's why I'm a fan of Rawls as well as Nozick, although they're often seen as rivals, that we should subject ourselves to a thought process. And he calls this thought process placing yourself in the original position behind a veil of ignorance, in which you strip away from yourself all of the things which are, if you like, accidents of birth. The colour of your skin, your gender, your sexuality, your religious beliefs, your IQ, your natural abilities, all of those are just part of the random lottery of life. We've got to strip those away, not knowing when we exit the original position and arrive on planet Earth, whether we're going to be black, white, male, female, tall, short, Christian, Muslim, atheist, IQ of 150, IQ of 50, physically fit or very ill. We don't know any of those things, and what would we agree to? And he broadly says we would agree to a liberal structure, that people should be able to have their own freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and all these sort of things. But he also suggests behind this veil of ignorance, and it's important to suggest he doesn't believe this process actually happens, right? It's just a concept. He doesn't believe we will meet in this mysterious sort of place somewhere in the universe. But he believes that we'd be quite risk adverse in terms of wealth and income behind the veil of ignorance, and we would agree to some sort of tax or redistribution or welfare system that would be designed to ensure that the worst off person in society was as best off as possible. He's not that worried about equality per se. He doesn't mind if there's lots of billionaires, but he thinks all of our focus would be on the poorest person, i.e. we would be concerned behind this veil of ignorance that the poorest person might end up being us. And so we would like to agree beforehand that the rich or the successful will have some of their money or resources redistributed to help that person who we risk being born as. And it's really that has been quite a lot of the intellectual underpinning of modern social liberalism and social democracy, a kind of small L liberal justification for welfareism and redistribution. And it's that really that Nozick goes for. There are other philosophical differences, quite sophisticated and important philosophical differences between the two men, but it's that question of welfareism and having a state that redistributes resources that Nozick tackles. But that was Rawls' contribution, and I think it's an interesting one. I mean, it's in some ways at its simplest, it's just encouraging us to use empathy, I guess, or to try and strip away the things that would make us prejudicial. You know, as the head of a think tank, perhaps I'm minded to support things that help think tanks, and you should really strip those away before you can actually have a sense of what a just law is, rather than us all pushing and edging for our own particular interests, which are, in Rawls's view, part of the lottery of life.
And what was, or what were Nozick's arguments or attack points against Rawls?
Well, there's quite a number of them. I mean, Nozick starts from a very rights-based position. I think he argues almost on the opening page that individuals have rights and that there are certain things that you cannot do to individuals without violating those rights. It's a rights-based approach. And he has a range of criticisms of John Rawls' approach here. And I have some myself, which are based on Nozick's thinking, but aren't necessarily explicit in Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. The first is to sort of say, well, can you really imagine what we would agree behind the veil of ignorance if we are sort of stripping away all of these things that make us different? If you take away from me my physical attributes, my mental attributes, my religious beliefs, my ideological beliefs, my gender, my sexuality, the colour of my skin, my IQ, and all of those things, what's left to make a decision? I mean, to some degree, aren't humans just the makeup of those different traits and characteristics? And if we strip them away, I mean, what's left other than a sort of skeleton? There's a criticism that Rawls just doesn't really leave anything there left to make a decision. There's also a suggestion that, a rather cheeky suggestion, that given a choice behind the veil of ignorance about the sort of society we would like to live in, and not knowing how we'd be born, the most rational thing to do is actually to select libertarian capitalism, libertarian free markets. That's actually the system empirically and scientifically that's best for the poorest, you know, not North Korea or Soviet communism or even Western social democracy, but the sort of world that Robert Nozick would like and defends for different reasons. But then he really comes down against what he calls patterned approaches to distribution. And to this extent, there's sort of echoes of Hayek about being skeptical that some sort of overall central plan can design what a minimum basic income should be or a minimum welfare standard should be. And he actually believes there's a rights violation involved in forcibly taking money from you and giving it to me just because I'm considered deserving. Nozick also sort of suggests that although our talents and our mental abilities, our physical abilities, our physical health may all be, if you like, part of the lottery of life, if you like, the lottery doesn't make us unentitled to those traits. Yes, maybe it is random whether your IQ is 150 or 120 or 110 or 80 or sub 50, maybe that is random, but that doesn't necessarily make the IQ any less yours. In the same way, if you buy a lottery ticket, I guess it's unfair that one person randomly wins, but we don't suggest that the winnings of that lottery aren't theirs. The lottery would have no purpose if you had to divide the winnings amongst everyone who actually had a lottery ticket. So although I think he's willing to accept the lottery of life, he still thinks that, you know, the brain you're born with and the physical traits that you're born with are yours, and that it's there risks being a violation of rights if people intercede and start confiscating from you properties or oblige you to use those talents for other people's betterment rather than your own. That's the side he comes down on. And I'm sure you're going to ask me about the basketball player Wilt Chamberlain, because that's the particular example he uses against what he calls patterned, welfare systems in which we decide that everyone will get X or the minimum income will be Y.
Okay, so how was the book received at the time? Because one of the things I often ask it on this series, was he someone who struggled to get his ideas shared at the time or supported at the time? Or was there a lot of criticism, or was he someone who people came to later? Okay, the book was written in 74, so we haven't got that sort of advantage of time. But how was Anarchy, State and Utopia received at the time?
Well, my understanding of it, and I'm trying to think when I must have first read it, say 1991. So okay, it would have been 17 years old at the time, but still, in terms of political theory, I mean, a relatively recent book, right? I mean, it was rather different to be reading Anarchy, State and Utopia, which had the feeling, the flavour, the language, the style of a very contemporary book compared to reading Locke's Second Treatise or Hobbes' Leviathan or let alone Plato or Aristotle. So you could say it was a book of its time. I mean, it is explosively controversial. He is nearly an anarchist. Crucially, he isn't an anarchist. It's important to understand that the word anarchy in the book is not what he's advocating. In fact, the first part of the book is an explanation, not a wholly satisfactory one in my view, but as to why he isn't an anarchist, and he believes that there is a justification for a night watchman state that would protect property and life and enforce contracts, but do nothing else, very strictly limited. So I don't really see him as an anarchist, but once you pull him out of the pool of anarchists, he's definitely, or at least the content of Anarchy, State and Utopia is definitely at the extreme end of libertarianism, right? It's a very devout, classical, liberal or libertarian piece. So my understanding at the time, I mean, I was only 2 years old when it was published, and I wasn't such a top child prodigy to have read it then, was that it was controversial, but he, along with John Rawls, I think sort of became the titans of intellectual modern liberalism. that it wasn't just a sort of that a theory of justice by John Rawls was the big text, and here was some sort of lunatic criticizing it. I think they have roughly equal standing in many, many ways, that they're two different interpretations and approaches to modern liberalism.
Now, some of the writers in this series have written a series of books, and they work up to a seminal work, and you can see that progression during time, or they write a number of works that we refer to. I think of Mises, I think of Hayek, I think of Smith, for example. Everyone talks about the wealth of nations, but doesn't pay so much attention to the theory of moral sentiments, for example. What about Robert Nozick? Did he work up this sort of libertarian case to this book, or did this come out of the blue? And how does this fit into the context of his other work?
Yeah, I mean, you probably need to discuss that with somebody who has a better grasp of Harvard in the 1970s, Harvard University in the 1970s, where Nozick was based, than I do, Syed. But my broad understanding is this is almost a one-off for Nozick. I mean, his other books are about general philosophy and perception and things like that, not in the field of political theory. So to that extent, he's wholly unlike a Hayek or a J.S. Mill. He seemed to have, and I don't know why, but he seems to have come to this as a sort of segue, doing something completely different. I mean, as if the IEA suddenly decided to publish a book on nuclear physics, not free market economics. It was sort of extracurricular in a way. And I don't know whether his background in other philosophy, for which he was more famous, assisted him in that. I don't know what motivated him, but it doesn't sit neatly within his career. He doesn't have a canon of work like a Hayek, for example. It really is just this book and then a whole range of secondary books around it. It's been such a famous and totemic book that you can buy endless books discussing its content and trying to understand its central core. And really the centerpiece of what he brings to the table, and although he made me a libertarian, I'm not sure I 100% agree with everything that he says here, is entitlement theory. So this idea that you may be entitled to things even if you don't deserve them. It may be unfair, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't the rightful owner of something. And the example he gives, and I do find this a fairly compelling one, it's not without some lacunas, I think, in the logic, but it is at least a really interesting example against these patterned views that, that everybody must have a certain amount or a minimum amount or an equal amount. Is he asks us to imagine, it's not very difficult to imagine because it's a pretty realistic example. He says, right, set whatever distribution of wealth you want, whatever you think the fairest is. Maybe that's everybody's got exactly the same wealth, or, everybody's within a band of 50%, or I don't know, people with physical and mental disabilities are granted a bigger pot to compensate them for the difficulties they're going to face in life, and those with, extraordinary abilities have a smaller pot. Whatever, pick whatever you want, he says, whatever you consider the fairest distribution, and let's just sort of call it year zero and imagine that that's what prevails. And he then says, well, imagine, you don't need to imagine, he asks us to picture the famous American basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain. I only discovered Wilt Chamberlain through Anarchy, State and Utopia, not knowing much about basketball. But the idea is Wilt Chamberlain, who happens to have incredible talents as a basketball player, and I understand he was one of the leading basketball players of his day, says, well, I'm willing to play for any basketball team, but when people come into the stadium to watch, I want 25 cents of every entry ticket to be put in a special Wilt Chamberlain bucket, and for that to be my salary. Then Nozick asks us to believe, which isn't much of a stretch, that because Americans like basketball a lot, and because Wilt Chamberlain's such a good player, a team would readily sign him up, and he would become a very, very rich man very quickly. Not because some central intelligence had voted that way, but just because loads and loads of people who like basketball would be throwing a quarter into the box. And before you know it, your pattern distribution, whatever you started with, has gone out of the window, because millions of us have thrown a 25 cents into Wilt Chamberlain's box, and Wilt Chamberlain gets rich. And Nozick sees that as legitimate. It might just be a luck and lottery that Wilt Chamberlain's really good at basketball and I'm not, but nevertheless, it is, he argues, Wilt Chamberlain's luck. I don't have a claim on Wilt Chamberlain's talents. So what Nozick was trying to say really was that a distribution of resources is justified by process, not by outcome. And that's something that obviously appeals to free market liberals. We're very interested in the process. And if the process step by step has been fair, then we would defend the outcome as being fair, even if it means there's substantially different amounts of wealth or people live in very different ways, if the stages have been fair. And he sees the stages as being, was your initial acquisition reasonable? Did you acquire whatever you've got and you could acquire that because there's more than enough to go around? So, for example, he believes anybody could acquire a cupful of sand from the Sahara Desert. There's more than enough to go around. If everybody wants a cupful of sand, you can have one. Or did you take it by force? But if you acquired the things legitimately and then received the things through voluntary exchange, it's yours. So those 25 cents in the bucket for Wilt Chamberlain, he believes belongs to Wilt Chamberlain. That the state can't come in and cream off 5 cents in every quarter for whatever its purposes are. That's Wilt Chamberlain's money. So if it's fairly acquired, and then there's a voluntary exchange amongst people, in this instance, from people who like watching basketball to a player who's very good at it, then the end result, Nozick argues, is a reasonable one. You can't aspire to some patterned distribution in which, say, everyone ends up with $20,000 a year, because actually very quickly, even if you start with that, people will diverge from it, because lots of people will spend their money on watching basketball players or paying for other talented people. And I think that's an interesting way, and a fairly compelling way, to frame the kind of the philosophy behind classical liberalism, that my talents, my abilities, my skills are mine. And if I gain from them through entirely free and voluntary exchange, then those gains are mine as well. And in a riff on Marx, I think Nozick uses the term, Marx obviously uses the term from each as they are able to each as they need. Nozick uses the term from each as they choose to each as they are chosen, and makes no judgment on how people make those choices freely. Those choices are, in Nozick's view, legit.
Now, we know that Nozick was a philosopher, and clearly, in some of the examples you've given, he's sort of expounding on thought experiments, if you like, and his book appears on university philosophy courses. But how influential do you think he's been in shaping the whole classical liberal narrative?
Well, fairly, but to my mind, insufficiently, actually. Very. I mean, he's probably, I say fairly, I mean, he probably is the leading libertarian political theorist of my lifetime, probably. I mean, he's certainly up there. What I think so special about him, and why I think organizations like the IEA should spend a little bit more time thinking about him, is that this is a political theory approach to classical liberalism. And very often, well, the clue at the IEA is in our name, the Institute of Economic Affairs, is that we make a case through the discipline of economics. Now, I'm not saying that that should be abandoned, but what Nozick does here is to make a moral case for libertarianism. His argument isn't that free market capitalism is, the best way of improving GDP or even maximizing consumer welfare. He's actually pretty indifferent on that point. He argues that it's a moral right, that it's the only way that you can respect individual rights, and that diverting from that, going beyond a night watchman state, is an unacceptable rights violation. So what I would say is I think he would have a greater standing in, if you like, the libertarian movement, if the libertarian movement gave as much thought and attention to political theorists and moral philosophers as we tend to economists, or even those that write about political economy. He's in a slightly different field here, but I think that's no reason at all to overlook Robert Nozick. If anything, I think that's a very good basis upon which to investigate his thinking even more, because there's not enough of it on the classical liberal side of the argument, in my view.
Do you think in this day and age, when we've got sort of shorter time attention spans, for example, and people are, in lockdown, people are more looking at more digital content, for example. Do you think we can make that case with books, or do you think we have to look at different media for that?
I'm not wedded to any on that. I mean, I don't think that the only way that you can understand Robert Nozick is to sit down and read Anarchy, State and Utopia from start to finish. I mean, what we're engaged in now, Syed, is using other media to try and explain Nozick. I mean, I hope I've given a sufficient introduction to whet somebody's appetite so they might go and read the book. I haven't just read Anarchy, State and Utopia. I've devoured virtually every book I can find interpreting Anarchy, State and Utopia. It's a very good one by John Meadowcroft, who, previously an employee of the IEA. But yeah, books matter, and I still think books do matter, because I don't think, even if I've been brilliantly erudite in this YouTube video, I don't think that short videos completely change people's lives or perspective. They can be a kind of gateway drug into the texts, and so that's what I hope I've achieved here, is just to give a pen picture, a sketch of Nozick's thinking that will encourage people to go to the primary text, because although I don't think Nozick's right about everything, I think he's right about a lot, and I don't think actually that the gauntlet that he put down, the challenge to the redistributionists, if you like, has yet been satisfactorily answered. So even if you're a free market liberal who favours some degree of redistribution, and I do, but it's a very visceral, sentimental, emotional position for me, and I really struggle to intellectually justify it. So the gauntlet that Nozick threw down, I think, in 1973 through Anarchy, State and Utopia was quite brilliant. Not only do I think it took, that it was a good way of rebutting some of the more interventionist parts of John Rawls' theory of justice, but I think it's laid down a substantial intellectual gauntlet for those who believe that rights infringements are justified, or more to the point, that taking somebody's resources and giving it to somebody else isn't a rights infringement. I think Nozick provides a pretty compelling, and I have to say, very, very well written. It's not heavy going, this book. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a racy read, but as political theory goes, this is pretty digestible. Yeah. It's definitely, and the intelligent layman can understand it. You don't need a PhD to understand it. So I think that what he wrote in 1974 has stood the test of time and remains one of the most important political theoretical texts for libertarians today.
Well, I've actually got my copy in front of me here. I was given it as a 25th birthday present by a flatmate at the time who was a philosophy student and not by no means a libertarian, but thought it was an interesting book. And what was interesting to me was how it built up the case from first principles, from a sort of state of nature, building up to protection agencies and dominant protection agencies, competing dominant protection agencies, and it really built up a really interesting case. I thought what was interesting about it was how it was a debate between thought experiments, if you like. Nozick was very critical of Rawls' thought experiment of the veil of ignorance, but Nozick himself was writing about a thought experiment, about building this up from for first principles. Now, on that, I wonder if I could ask you about that, because in the same way he was critical of Rawls' thought experiment, there are some criticisms of Nozick's thought experiment. For example, a very obvious criticism is, well, that's all very well, but we don't start from a state of nature, do we? We start from where we are now with quite a developed state. Many classical liberals would say too large a state. How do you get to where you want to be from where we are, for example? And that's where conservatives and classical liberals, for example, might disagree. What are your particular critiques of Nozick's thesis?
Well, I think you're right, to say that Nozick doesn't address and isn't particularly helpful in that question. He doesn't sort of say in the way that a free market think tank might, that spending on the National Health Service is a little too high or is somewhat wasteful, or shouldn't welfareism be targeted a bit better. He is building it from first principles. So, and he's an academic and a theorist. His aim wasn't to, advise the American Republican Party on how to trim back the state a bit. He was appealing to his readers on building their view of the world from first principles. You are right, however, that this is all about thought experiments. And I think an interesting test of political theory is the extent to which these are sort of thought experiment constructs to just justify our intrinsic prejudices. That, you know, I kind of feel libertarian, now I want a text that intellectually justifies that libertarianism. Or I feel socialist, so I want an intellectual text that justifies that socialism. And the reason I can personally testify that I don't think that Nozick falls into that trap was I found him compelling. He changed my view of the world. So it is about thought experiments. It doesn't tell you how to get from where we are now to something better. It tells you that we shouldn't have got to where we are now. That's all the book says. It doesn't, I don't think it has an ambition beyond that. But I think if more people read it and engaged with it, more people would see the world through libertarian or classical liberal eyes, even, as I say, if you don't agree with everything that Nozick says. And for an organisation like the IEA, we're engaged in changing the climate of opinion, not in tweaks to policy. Anarchy, State and Utopia is a book that I think can, and to some degree, has changed the climate of opinion. It's not a roadmap to better public policy. That's not his aim at all. It is a thought experiment about what can and cannot be justified by way of state coercive action. And at the very least, I think he gives a pretty compelling account why action beyond the bare minimum by the state is extremely hard to countenance if you take a very liberal view of the world and if you believe that individuals have rights. And that makes it a colossally important contribution to the canon of classical liberal thinking.
Now, you say he doesn't produce a roadmap for us in any way. We are speaking now, we're not both in the office. This is lockdown as a result of the pandemic. Do you think if anyone had approached him, he was still alive and it was during this pandemic, and someone approached him and say, how do you apply some of the lessons from Anarchy, State and Utopia to government interventions that you've seen during the pandemic? Do you think he would have taken that challenge, and what do you think he might have said?
Well, that's an interesting question because, although I can't remember the chapter and verse of this, an annoyance on two counts, really, is that Nozick, in a latter book, which was nothing to do with Anarchy, State and Utopia, makes some reference in the introduction or the foreword or the acknowledgements that he no longer considers himself a libertarian. But I think it's been lost to the mists of time about why. I think I've got that right, but I'm pretty sure he didn't then write about, you know, I think I actually got all this wrong in chapter 2 or chapter 6. So there seems to be some evidence that he changed his mind, which he rather sort of almost flippantly refers to. So had Nozick lived longer, or if he was still with us today, he died in 2002, it's difficult to know what sort of response he'd make. Maybe he himself is no longer fully persuaded of the argument that he puts forward in Anarchy, State and Utopia. But let's say that he was alive today and that he stuck religiously to that initial text. I think what he'd say about the pandemic, and he definitely covers this in Anarchy, State and Utopia, is that you need to, if you like, remove the monopoly of the state in a large number of areas, and people can come together and congregate in their own different communities. He would allow an overarching state to use force to ensure that, you know, murder wasn't taking place and that individual rights weren't being breached. But my guess would be on something like the pandemic and the lockdown, he would ideally like, and you can immediately spot a lot of practical problems with this, but you're talking to a theorist or a philosopher here, that we club together in different ways. That sort of, well, you know, some part of England or the world can be one in which the rules are that you cannot leave your house until COVID-19 and the common cold and seasonal flu have been completely eradicated. Other parts might take a much riskier approach. And although the pandemic and the lockdown are, you know, to some degree, genuine public good questions, not just negative externality questions, it's quite difficult to see how one cohort can act without affecting the other cohort. My guess would be that Nozick would say that the best way of looking at this philosophically and theoretically is to make it easier for cohorts to organise themselves into their own communities, geographically based, that have their own very different sets of rules. and that you could imagine the UK breaking up not so much into England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but into hundreds of different communes and villages and towns and cities and housing estates with very different sets of rules, and you would go and select the one that suited you. I think that would be the way that he would approach it, and that different risks can then be taken by different cohorts, and even if they're collective, if you like, the 10 square miles or something might be the same rules apply. You can't have everybody living differently, but even if they're collective pursuits, that's not necessarily a reason why free individuals can't agree to a common collective provision or a common collective set of rules. But you should be open-minded to enough to accept that a set of rules that exists over here in the northeast might not exist over there in the southwest. Different rules, different clubs, different societies could also apply at what we presently consider to be a monopoly state political level. I think if he was true to Anarchy, State and Utopia's text in 1974, that's broadly speaking how he would break it down in theory. How you do that in practice, of course, is a matter for practitioners and public policy experts, which Nozick didn't claim to be. But as a theoretician, I think he's one of the very best.
Well, Mark, it's been a fascinating discussion about Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State and Utopia in particular, and his challenge to Rawls' theory of justice. I wonder if I could end on the note, if someone said to you, Mark, you've chosen Nozick, tell me in a couple of sentences why I should read Nozick, or why I should read Anarchy, State and Utopia. What would your answer be?
It is incredibly radical. It pulls no punches. It's not a middle-of-the-road book. It doesn't try and defend a prevailing consensus. So if you like to be challenged, you'll find it a great read. If you're one of the overwhelming majority of people who do not consider themselves libertarian, I would think it's probably about the most cogent and articulate philosophical case for it. And third, finally, but by no means least, it is brilliantly well written. You won't fall asleep reading it. It is a pretty racy read insofar as political theory books can be a racy read. So the fact that it's challenging, the fact that it supports a position which is a marginal position in terms of the intellectual commanding heights of the Western world, and the fact that it's just so superbly constructed are a very good reason to pick this book up from Amazon and plough your way through it.
Mark Littlewood, Director General of the IEA, thank you very much for joining us for this series. Can I thank the viewers and listeners for watching and listening today. For more details of our online content, please visit our website, iea.org.uk, subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London, or listen to our podcast on Podbean. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at iea.org.uk/donate-now. Thank you for watching or listening today. We hope you'll join us again soon.